Hi guys. Tonight we will travel back in time, but not to the great victories or noble heroes you've heard so much about, but to a quieter, more intimate corner of history. We will go to ancient Rome, the city of stone and splendor, and we will not focus on the emperors. No, tonight we will shine a soft light on the women behind the thrones. These aren't figures from serene statues or noble legends. These are queens, empresses, and matriarchs who bent the world to their will. Before diving into the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where in the world you're rewatching from and what time it is for you. I am genuinely curious. Our first subject, a woman whose name still whispers through the marble halls of history, is Livia Drusilla. To understand her, you must first understand the world she inhabited. You're in a city of dizzying ambition. It's a place where power is everything, and the path to it is paved with a series of alliances, betrayals, and conveniently timed ... accidents. The Republic is a memory, and the new Emperor Augustus is forging a new world. He is a man of immense control, a figure of stoic virtue. But even the great Augustus needed a partner, a First Lady of Rome, and in Livia he found his perfect match. Or perhaps you might say, she found her perfect puppet. Livia wasn't merely a consort. She was a architect of the nascent Roman Empire. Her influence was subtle, but it was absolute. You see, the Romans had a profound distrust of open power for women. A Roman matron's power was meant to be exercised in the domestic sphere, not in the Senate or the Forum. But Livia, with a cunning that bordered on genius, mastered the art of wielding power without ever seeming to. She was the ideal Roman wife on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior was a mind of pure, focused ambition. Born in 58 BC, Livia came from a powerful and old Roman family, but her early life was far from easy. Her father chose the wrong side in a civil war against Augustus, a choice that forced Livia to flee. But Livia was a survivor, and more than that, she was an operator. In 38 BC, she and Augustus met. He was instantly captivated. You can almost see the scene. The powerful, ambitious leader seeing in this young, intelligent woman not just a wife, but a political asset. He was already married, and so was she. But these were minor details in the Roman world. Both were quickly divorced, and Livia married Augustus, not for love, but for a destiny that would make her one of the most powerful women in history. Her first act of quiet, almost undetectable cunning was to manage the delicate social dynamics of the Roman elite. You see, the old guard, the senators, and noble families were deeply suspicious of Augustus's new power. Livia, with her impeccable lineage and calm demeanor, was the bridge between the old and the new. She was the picture of a traditional Roman wife, dressing modestly, weaving her own clothes, and managing the imperial household with an iron fist. But beneath that serene exterior, a mind of pure, focused ambition was at work. She was more than a wife. She was Augustus's most trusted advisor, his confidant, and his eyes and ears in a city filled with whispers and plots. She was the one who could sniff out a potential conspiracy before it bloomed, who could gently guide her husband's decisions, making him believe her ideas were his own. It was a masterclass in soft power, a gentle, almost imperceptible hand that shaped the destiny of an empire. But her ambition truly came to the fore in the matter of succession. Augustus, for all his power, faced a perennial Roman problem. Who would follow him? He had no sons of his own, only a daughter, Julia. His preferred heirs were his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the sons of his daughter and his most trusted friend, Agrippa. Livia had her own plans. Her goal was to have her own son, Tiberius, a quiet, surly man from her first marriage, ascend to the throne. To do this, she needed to clear a path, and a series of unfortunate, almost unbelievable events began to unfold. You might think of it like a game of chess, a slow, methodical removal of pieces from the board. First, Agrippa, Augustus's friend and a potential rival to Tiberius, died suddenly and unexpectedly. Then the two young grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, the heirs apparent, also met with mysterious ends. Gaius died from a wound he received in a minor battle, a wound that should not have been fatal. Lucius fell ill and died on a journey. And another son, Agrippa, Postumus, was exiled, conveniently removing him from the line of succession. Livia, throughout all of this, maintained a public face of grief and piety. She was the consoling wife, the grieving mother-in-law. To the world, she was a woman of sorrow, but to those who were watching closely, she was a quiet force of nature, moving events with a silent, deadly precision. The whispers in Rome grew louder. People started to wonder if Livia had a special talent for herbal remedies. If she knew just the right kind of plant to use in a moment of ... convenience. The Roman historian Tacitus, never one to mince words, suggested that she might have had a hand in the deaths of all the men who stood in her son's way. He even went so far as to suggest that she poisoned Augustus himself. The story goes that Augustus, growing old and frail, had begun to suspect Livia's quiet machinations. He was supposedly on his deathbed when Livia, hearing that he was recovering, offered him some fresh figs from the garden. Figs were his favorite. She had, as the story goes, poisoned some on the tree itself. It's a chilling tale, a perfect blend of domesticity and high-stakes drama. We don't know if it's true, of course, but the fact that the story was even told tells you everything you need to know about Livia's reputation. In the end, Livia got what she wanted. With all of Augustus's male heirs gone, the only one left was her son Tiberius. Augustus, with no other choice, adopted Tiberius as his successor. When Augustus died, Livia was at his side, holding his hand. She would live for another 15 years, a powerful matriarch who continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes even after her son was on the throne. Tiberius, it said, was deeply resentful of his mother's power and her constant meddling. He even tried to stop her from being deified, a final spiteful act against the woman who had made him emperor. But it was too late. Livia had won. Her legacy was not one of conquest or war, but of a quiet, relentless, and ruthless ambition that reshaped the Roman world. And so, we leave you with the gentle but firm image of Livia, a woman who, under the serene surface of a devoted wife, was a master manipulator. She reminds us that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the shadows, a calm, steady hand that quietly and lethally changes the course of an empire. As you drift off to sleep, you can imagine her in her Roman villa, meticulously planning her next move, a woman who proved that the greatest battles are not always fought with swords, but with quiet cunning and a poison-tipped fig. If Livia's power was a slow, creeping vine, Messalina's was a wild, uncontrollable fire. You see, while Livia operated in the shadows, Messalina reveled in the spotlight. She was the great-grandniece of Augustus and the third wife of the Emperor Claudius. You can picture her in your mind's eye, a beautiful, vivacious young woman with a reputation that would make the most hardened Roman senator blush. She was, by all accounts, a dazzling figure, but her beauty was matched only by her boundless appetites. In a city where excess was a way of life, Messalina was the master of it. She took a kind of perverse joy in breaking every social convention, every unwritten rule that governed the behavior of Roman high society. And she did it all with a shocking sense of impunity. You might be thinking of a typical scandalous queen, a woman who engaged in a few affairs here and there. But Messalina was no ordinary queen. She was, according to the Roman historians, a woman obsessed with pushing every boundary. Her ambition was not political like Livia's. Her ambition was carnal. She was driven by a desire for new experiences, for new men, and for a reputation as the most sexually liberated woman in Rome. It was an ambition that was both a source of her power and, ultimately, the cause of her downfall. She was a woman who didn't just have affairs, she made a spectacle of them. One of the most infamous stories about her, a story so outrageous you might think it's a fable, is her contest against a Roman prostitute. The story told by the historian Pliny the Elder goes that Messalina, hiding her identity with a wig and a false name, challenged the most famous prostitute in Rome to a contest to see who could have the most partners in a single night. The contest took place in a brothel, a public place, and Messalina, according to the accounts, won the competition with a shocking display of endurance. The story is a perfect metaphor for her life. She wasn't just a woman who had affairs. She was a woman who wanted to be the best at it. A woman who craved recognition, even in the most sordid of pursuits. It was a kind of perverse narcissism, a desire to be the most famous, even if that fame was for all the wrong reasons. This particular tale, while possibly embellished by Roman chroniclers eager for a sensational story, reveals the core of her character. She craved not just pleasure, but a kind of perverse immortality, a fame built on the ashes of social decorum. It was a desperate cry for attention in a world that, despite her status, often saw her as little more than a vessel for dynastic ambitions. You can almost hear the hushed whispers of the city as the rumors of her exploits spread like wildfire, painting a picture of a woman who was both feared and scandalized in equal measure. Messalina's husband, Claudius, was a strange and complex figure. He was an emperor who, by all accounts, was clumsy, easily manipulated, and perhaps a little naive. You see, he had a stutter and a limp, and the Roman elite had long underestimated him. They saw him as a fool, a bumbling figurehead. But beneath that bumbling exterior, he was an intellectual, a scholar, a historian. And it was this contrast, this strange mix of scholarly reclusiveness and public awkwardness, that made him so susceptible to Messalina's charms. He was, it seems, utterly besotted with her. He was, as they say, a man who wore his heart on his sleeve, and Messalina knew exactly how to play him. She used his trust, his naivete, and his devotion to her to get everything she wanted. While he was busy with his books and his administrative duties, she was busy living a life of unimaginable excess, a life that was hidden in plain sight. She wasn't just his wife, she was his handler, the one who controlled his emotions and his decisions, often to the detriment of his own interests and the stability of the empire. Messalina wasn't just a libertine. She was also a master of revenge. She used her influence over Claudius to eliminate anyone who got in her way. You see, her lovers were not just men of passion, they were often men of power. And if they dared to refuse her advances, or if they became a threat to her social standing, she would simply use her power to have them executed. She was a woman who used her sexuality as a weapon, a tool to gain power and to settle scores. It was a kind of terrifying efficiency, a combination of carnal desire and cold, calculating ambition. This wasn't merely about desire, it was about dominance. To refuse her was to challenge her authority, and Messalina was not a woman who tolerated defiance. The Roman court, a place already rife with intrigue, became a stage for her personal vendettas, with lives and fortunes hanging on her fleeting whims. Whispers of poisoned wine and politically motivated arrests followed her wherever she went, creating an atmosphere of fear that was as potent as her beauty. One of the most famous victims of her wrath was a prominent senator, Valerius Asiaticus. He had made the mistake of spurning her affections, and in her rage, she accused him of plotting against the emperor. Despite being a highly respected figure, Asiaticus was executed. A chilling reminder of how easily a powerful woman's whim could seal a man's fate in Rome. You can almost feel the tension in the air. The fear that gripped the city's elite as they wondered if they would be her next target. The constant fear of falling out of her favor created a climate of paranoia where no one was truly safe. But all fires, no matter how wild, eventually burn out. Messalina's downfall came when she did something so outrageous, so public, that even the naive Claudius could no longer ignore it. She married one of her lovers, a nobleman named Gaius Silius, in a public ceremony while Claudius was away from the city. The act was a declaration of treason, a public challenge to the very foundation of the Roman state. It was a sign that she believed she was above the law, above even the emperor himself. The news of the marriage reached Claudius, and for the first time, the sleepy, easily manipulated emperor was filled with a terrifying rage. He was not just angry, he was betrayed. The man who had been a bumbling fool was now a king, a man who had finally realized that his world was crumbling. The final moments of her reign were a frantic, desperate attempt to survive. After being arrested, she fled to the gardens of Lucullus, the very place she had once held court, and tried to hide. It was a tragic, pathetic end for a woman who had once been the center of Roman society. Messalina's final moments were as dramatic as her life. She was arrested and executed, a swift and brutal end to a life of unimaginable excess. She was just 26 years old. Her story, a cautionary tale of boundless ambition and unchecked desire, would become a legend. Roman historians, fascinated and horrified by her life, would paint her as a monster of debauchery, a woman who was the living embodiment of everything that was wrong with the Roman elite. But as you drift off to sleep, you can wonder if she was just a product of her time, a woman who, in a world where women were meant to be silent, chose to be loud unapologetically and catastrophically so. Her legacy is not of empire or conquest, but of a kind of rebellion, a brazen refusal to conform to the expectations of a society that sought to confine her. She was a storm of a woman, a chaotic and destructive force of nature who, in the end, was consumed by her own fire. Her life, though short, serves as a powerful reminder that while some seek power for glory, others seek it for a more primal need, to simply exist on their own terms, no matter the cost. She was a woman who dared to live a life that was both scandalous and, in its own way, fiercely independent. A woman who, in her own unique and destructive way, left a mark on history that would never be erased. In the grand theater of Rome, where every emperor was a performer and every senator a critic, there emerged a character so flamboyant, so utterly theatrical, that she would make even Messalina seem like a quiet church mouse. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. You see, while Messalina's power was a chaotic storm, Agrippina's was a finely honed blade, a precise and deadly instrument used with chilling calculation. She was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted: to have her son Nero on the throne and to rule the Roman Empire through him. Her ambition was not a whispered secret. It was a loud and public declaration, and she pursued it with a single-mindedness that was terrifying to behold. Agrippina was born into the very heart of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the granddaughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, the niece and fourth wife of Claudius, and the mother of Nero. It was a family tree, so tangled with incest and murder that it would make your head spin. But Agrippina was not a victim of her family. She was a master of it. She learned to survive in a world where a single misstep could lead to exile or a quick, quiet death. She watched her brother Caligula descend into madness, and she saw her uncle, Claudius, rise to power. She learned from their mistakes and from their triumphs, and she waited for her moment to strike. Her youth was a crucible of survival, a brutal education in the art of political manipulation. She saw firsthand how her mother, the celebrated Agrippina the Elder, was persecuted and ultimately starved to death by the Emperor Tiberius. These traumas didn't break her. They forged her into something harder, more calculating. She understood that in the Roman court, sentiment was a weakness and power was the only true currency. Her first act of cold, calculated ambition was to convince her uncle Claudius to marry her. You must remember that Claudius was a man who, despite his quirks, was deeply respected for his scholarship and his administrative abilities. But he was also a man who was easily manipulated, especially by women he adored. After the downfall of his previous wife, Messalina, Claudius was in a fragile state, easily swayed by a woman who could offer him the stability he so craved. Agrippina was a beautiful and intelligent woman, a perfect foil for his bumbling exterior. She played on his weaknesses, flattered his intellect, and convinced him that her marriage to him would bring stability to the dynasty. And so, in a move that shocked the Roman elite, she married her own uncle. But the marriage was not about love, it was about power. It was a stepping stone, a way to place her in a position of influence from which she could launch her master plan. The marriage was a public relations masterpiece designed to solidify her position and legitimize her son's path to power. You can almost see her, smiling serenely as the horrified whispers of the Roman Senate filled the halls. A woman who knew exactly how to use appearances to mask her ruthless ambition. The next step in her plan was to convince Claudius to name her son Nero as his heir. You see, Claudius already had a son, a young man named Britannicus, from his previous marriage to Messalina. Britannicus was the natural heir, the rightful successor. But Agrippina was a woman who did not believe in rightful. She believed in expedient. She used her influence over Claudius to convince him that Nero, who is older and more mature, was the better choice. She even went so far as to have Britannicus's tutors and allies removed, isolating the young man and leaving him vulnerable. It was a slow, deliberate campaign of psychological and political warfare, a masterpiece of manipulation, and it worked. Claudius, swayed by Agrippina's constant flattery and her relentless pressure, named Nero as his successor. She solidified this position further by having Nero betrothed to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, linking the two families and making Nero's claim to the throne even more ironclad. It was a game of chess, and Agrippina was a grandmaster, always thinking several moves ahead. But Agrippina was not a woman who believed in waiting. When Claudius began to show signs of wavering in his decision, perhaps feeling a pang of guilt for disinheriting his own son, she took matters into her own hands. According to the historians, she poisoned him with a dish of poisoned mushrooms, a grim joke on his favorite meal. The timing was perfect. Claudius's death was sudden, but not suspicious enough to raise an alarm. With Claudius dead, the path was clear for Nero to ascend to the throne. And so, in a swift and brutal act, Agrippina seized power. She had won. Her son was the emperor, and she was the power behind the throne. The moment she had worked for her entire life had arrived, and she reveled in it. She was no longer just the sister, niece, or wife of an emperor. She was the mother of the man who ruled the Roman world. But Agrippina's reign was not without its own brand of depravity. You see, she was not content with just being the mother of the emperor. She wanted to rule. She had herself declared empress and made herself the co-ruler of the empire. She appeared on coins with her son, a symbol of her unprecedented power. She attended Senate meetings, a move that was unheard of for a woman, and she openly advised her son on matters of state. She was a woman who was so obsessed with power that she could not let it go, even when it was in her grasp. She was a possessive and domineering mother, a woman who sought to control every aspect of her son's life, from his political decisions to his personal affairs. She even went so far as to try to control his love life, a move that would ultimately be her downfall. Her desire for control was absolute. She wasn't satisfied with pulling the strings from behind the curtain. She wanted to be on the stage, in the spotlight, and she made it clear to everyone that Nero's power was her power. But as Nero grew older, he began to resent his mother's influence. He was a young man who wanted to rule on his own terms, and he was tired of being her puppet. He began to resist her influence, to make his own decisions, and to pursue his own passions. The conflict between mother and son became a public spectacle, a bitter and brutal power struggle. Agrippina, for all her cunning and ambition, was no match for her son's growing madness. She had created a monster, and now that monster was turning on her. The final horrifying act in their drama was Nero's attempt to kill his mother. He tried to have her drowned, but she miraculously survived. He then sent a team of assassins to kill her, and she, knowing her time had come, famously told them to strike at my womb, the very source of the son who had betrayed her. It was a chilling and tragic end for a woman who had spent her entire life in a relentless pursuit of power. Her last words were a final, desperate act of defiance, a moment of recognition that the greatest power she had ever wielded had turned into her undoing. Her life was a tragic play, with a final act that was as brutal as it was inevitable. Agrippina's life was a testament to the destructive nature of unchecked ambition. In her relentless pursuit of power, she became a force of nature, a storm that swept away all who stood in her path. But in the end, she was consumed by the very fire she had ignited. Her story is a haunting whisper through history, a powerful reminder that the price of absolute control is often absolute loneliness, and that the greatest tragedy is not to be defeated by one's enemies, but to be undone by the very legacy one created. She had sought to control the world, but in the end, her own son. The very symbol of her ambition was the one who would bring her to ruin. It is a timeless story of a woman who played the game of power and in the end lost everything but in her losing. She forever changed the course of history, her ghost forever haunting the halls of the Roman Empire. A reminder that even the most powerful can fall. The Roman Empire, by the time of our next subject, had settled into a period of relative peace and prosperity. The chaos of the Julio-Claudians had passed. The empire was ruled by a succession of competent and, in some cases, truly virtuous men. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in particular, was a figure of unparalleled dignity and wisdom. He was a philosopher king, a man who, in his private moments, wrote meditations on Stoicism, a philosophy that preached self-control, reason, and an unwavering commitment to duty. But even a man as disciplined as Marcus Aurelius was not immune to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the human heart. And his life was intertwined with a woman who was, by many accounts, his polar opposite. Her name was Faustina the Younger. Now, Faustina was born into the very heart of the Antonine dynasty. She was the daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius, a man known for his peaceful and stable reign. From a young age, she was a symbol of dynastic continuity, destined to marry a future emperor. She was eventually betrothed and married to her cousin, Marcus Aurelius, a man who would become one of the most respected figures in Roman history. Their marriage was, on the surface, a partnership of equals. A perfect political match that brought together two of the most powerful families in the empire. You might imagine them walking through the palace gardens, a picture of tranquility discussing philosophy and poetry. But the whispers of the Roman court told a very different story. You see, the court was a place of endless gossip. And in the hushed halls of the imperial palace, the stories about Faustina were a constant and salacious hum. She was a woman who was said to be driven by a wild and insatiable passion. a desire for pleasure that her stoic husband could not or would not satisfy. The stories were of a shocking variety, and they were told with a kind of breathless awe. The most persistent rumors spoke of a deep and unseemly affection for gladiators and sailors. The gladiator stories were particularly vivid, painting a picture of an empress who would slip out of the palace at night, her face hidden by a veil, to meet her lovers in the smoky, blood-stained quarters of the Colosseum. The sailors, it was said, were her other weakness, their rough hands and simple. Honest lives a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the Roman court. It was as if she sought out a kind of primal, raw masculinity that was absent from her life as empress. She was not a woman of refined tastes in men, but a woman who was drawn to a more base and carnal form of pleasure, a kind of passion that her husband in his pursuit of stoic tranquility could not comprehend. Her alleged lovers were not powerful senators or noblemen, but common men, who lived lives of brutal simplicity, and in their arms she was said to have found a freedom that was denied to her in the gilded cage of the imperial palace. And the rumors only grew wilder. It was said that she was so besotted with a gladiator that after he was killed in a fight, she confessed her obsession to her husband. Marcus Aurelius, a man of profound wisdom and philosophical calm, was said to have consulted with the Chaldean seer. The seer, in a truly bizarre piece of advice, told the emperor to have his wife bathe in the dead gladiator's blood. The act was meant to purify her of her unholy lust. Whether this grotesque story is true or simply a piece of vicious gossip, it illustrates the kind of depraved reputation she had earned. It paints a picture of a woman whose passions were so strong, so overwhelming, that they could only be contained by an act of savage ritual. It is a story that speaks not only to her alleged depravity, but also to her husband's unwavering love and his willingness to go to the most bizarre lengths to save her soul. He was a man who, in his own way, was as passionate as she was. But his passion was for his wife, and his love was a force of nature in its own right. But Faustina's alleged depravity was not just a matter of the heart. The whispers of the court also spoke of a woman who was a master of political intrigue. You see, while her husband was a philosopher, he was also a soldier. He spent a great deal of his reign on the battlefield, fighting the Marcomannic Wars on the northern frontier. While he was away, Faustina was left in charge of the palace, a position of immense power and influence. It was during this time that the most serious accusation against her emerged, that she was conspiring to overthrow her own husband. The man she was said to be in league with was a Roman general named Avidius Cassius. He was a man of great ambition, and he had been a loyal friend and commander to Marcus Aurelius. But in a sudden and shocking twist, he declared himself emperor. The rumors flew that Faustina had instigated the rebellion, promising to marry Cassius and make him emperor if he succeeded. It was a staggering betrayal, a calculated act of treachery that would have made even Agrippina the younger proud. The rebellion ultimately failed, and Cassius was killed. But Marcus Aurelius, in a display of his characteristic magnanimity, refused to believe that his wife was involved. He burned all the letters and documents from the rebellion, ensuring that her name would never be officially tied to the plot. He was a man who, in his heart, was so devoted to his wife that he was willing to ignore the very evidence of her treachery. A testament to a love that was, in its own way, as profound as it was blind. It is a curious thing, isn't it? The most stoic and virtuous of emperors married to a woman who was, according to history, a whirlwind of debauchery and ambition. Was she truly a depraved and monstrous figure? Or was she simply a victim of vicious gossip and a male-dominated historical record? The historians of the time were not kind to her. They painted her as a conniving and faithless empress, a woman who sought pleasure and power at every turn. But you must consider the source. Many of the historians who wrote about her were men who were deeply uncomfortable with women in positions of power. Perhaps her crime was not adultery or treason, but simply a refusal to conform to the docile and demure image of a Roman empress. She was a woman who lived with a philosopher, but she was a creature of passion, and perhaps that was her greatest sin. She was a woman who was perhaps too alive, too full of a fiery spirit that could not be contained by the quiet, contemplative life of a Stoic empress. Her life was a constant struggle between her own wild nature and the rigid expectations of the Roman court. A battle that she was destined to lose, but in her losing, she created a legend that would last for centuries. In the end, Faustina's story is a fascinating paradox. She was the beloved wife of a great emperor, a mother to 13 children, and a woman who was, according to some, a public symbol of virtue. But she was also, according to others, a figure of shocking depravity, a woman who was driven by a wild and untamed heart. She lived and died in a world that was torn between the virtues of Stoicism and the vices of excess. She was a woman who, in her own quiet way, became a legend. Her name forever etched in the annals of scandal, a ghost that whispers through the marbled halls of Roman history. Her life reminds us that history is not a simple story of good and evil, but a tangled web of truth and rumor, and that the greatest mysteries are often not what a person did, but who they truly were. Her legacy, unlike her alleged passions, is not an open book, but a riddle, a paradox that continues to captivate and bewilder us to this day. Her story is a timeless reminder that even in an age of reason and virtue, the wild and untamed heart of a woman can become a legend, a force of nature that cannot be contained by the cold and calculating world of politics. She was a woman who, in her own way, defied the Roman world, and in her defiance, she became immortal. The Roman Empire. Having survived the chaotic reigns of the Julio-Claudians and the philosophical rule of the Antonines, found itself in a new era, one defined by constant civil war and political instability. The Gilded Age of peace was over, replaced by a brutal period where emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. In this new world, a woman had to be more than just a wife or a mother. She had to be a survivor, a political schemer, and, at times, a ruthless killer. Our next subject, Julia Domna, was all of these things, and in her ambition, she would prove to be a force of nature that no man could contain. Julia Domna was not a Roman noble. She was a Syrian, born in the ancient city of Emesa, in a family of high priests who worshipped the sun god Elagabalus. This was not a minor detail. The cult of Elagabalus was a powerful and ancient force in the East, a religion steeped in mysticism and ritual. Julia Domna grew up in a world of spiritual power, of sacred rituals, and of a belief that the heavens were a constant and active part of human affairs. It was a background that gave her a certain mystique, a kind of spiritual authority that was both respected and feared by the Romans, who viewed the Eastern cults with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. From a young age, she was destined for greatness, and she had a mind that was as sharp as any Roman senator's. She was a woman of immense intelligence and ambition, a woman who, with a quiet and calculating grace, would make her way to the heart of the Roman Empire. Her path to power began in a moment of pure serendipity, when she met Septimius Severus, a Roman general who was on a meteoric rise to power. He was a man of cold, hard ambition, a man who saw in her not just a beautiful woman, but a powerful political tool. He was a man who, like her, was not a Roman from the old families, but a provincial from North Africa, a man who had to fight and scheme his way to the top. Their marriage was a calculated partnership, a political alliance that would change the course of Roman history. He needed her Eastern connections and her spiritual power to legitimize his rule. And she needed his military might to gain the power she so desperately craved. Theirs was not a love story in the classical sense, but a partnership of equals, a union of two people who saw in each other a mirror of their own ruthless ambition. Septimius Severus would eventually become emperor, but his rise to power was a bloody and brutal affair. He fought and defeated 3 other rivals, a long and exhausting civil war that left the empire in a state of exhaustion. But through it all, Julia Dumna was by his side, a constant and unwavering source of support. She was a woman who was not afraid of the battlefield, a woman who would often accompany her husband on his military campaigns. She was his confidant, his advisor, and his most trusted ally. She was the power behind the throne, a woman who ruled the empire not from the shadows, but from the front lines. She was a woman who understood the importance of image, and she used her exotic background and her intellectual prowess to create a public persona that was both mysterious and powerful. She was a patron of the arts and philosophy, and her court was a gathering place for the greatest minds of the Roman world, a kind of salon where poets, philosophers, and historians would gather to discuss the great questions of the day. She was a woman who was respected and feared in equal measure, a woman who had managed to find a way to be a ruler in her own right, even in a world that was dominated by men. She was known as a philosopher, a scholar, and a patron of the arts. But beneath that cultured exterior was a will of iron. A woman who would stop at nothing to ensure her family's continued reign. But her life was not without its own brand of depravity. You see, Julia Domna was obsessed with power, and in her pursuit of it, she made some truly monstrous decisions. Her greatest tragedy and her greatest scandal was the relationship between her 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. The brothers hated each other with a passion that was both legendary and terrifying. They fought constantly, and their rivalry was a constant source of tension in the imperial court. Julia Dumna, instead of trying to reconcile her sons, seemed to do the opposite. She played them against each other, a dark and twisted game of political manipulation that was designed to ensure her continued influence over the empire. She was a mother who was so obsessed with power that she was willing to sacrifice the well-being of her own children for it. Her cold, calculating ambition had poisoned the very people she was supposed to love and protect. She was a woman who, in her relentless pursuit of power, had become a monster. Her sons, in their own way, were a reflection of her own ambition, a product of a world where power was the only thing that mattered, and where love and family were just tools to be used in the game of politics. The final act of their family drama was a horrifying spectacle. After the death of their father, Septimius Severus, the 2 brothers were named Copeperus, but their hatred was so great that they could not share power. And so, in a final, brutal act, Caracalla murdered his own brother Geta in their mother's arms. The scene was one of unimaginable horror, a moment of pure, unadulterated evil. Julia Dumna was left to mourn her dead son, a woman who was a victim of her own ambition. She had created a monster, and that monster had destroyed her family. But she was not broken. She was a woman who had seen it all, and she was a woman who would not be defeated. She would continue to wield power to advise her murderous son and to try to hold the Roman Empire together, even as it was tearing itself apart. She was a survivor, a woman who would not be defeated by the very forces she had unleashed. She was a woman who, in her own way, was as monstrous as the son she had created. A tragic figure who had traded her soul for the power she so desperately craved. She was a woman who had to watch her own family be torn apart by the very ambition she had so carefully cultivated. A woman who, in her relentless pursuit of power, had lost everything that was truly important. Julia Domna's life was a testament to the fact that power, even for a woman, could be a corrosive force, a thing that could destroy everything and everyone in its path. She was a woman who, in her own quiet and calculating way, left a mark on history that would never be erased. Her legacy is a haunting whisper through the corridors of time. It's a powerful reminder that the price of absolute control is often absolute loneliness, and that the greatest tragedies are often not what a person does, but what they become in their relentless pursuit of power. She was a woman who in her own way ruled the Roman Empire. But in her ruling, she lost everything that was truly important, and in her losing, she became an enduring and tragic figure. A timeless reminder of the high price of ambition. Her story is a timeless lesson in the dangers of unchecked power, a story that reminds us that even the greatest of intellectual minds and the most cunning of political schemers can be destroyed by the very forces they seek to control. The Roman Empire was, by the time of our next subject, no longer the sprawling, unified superpower of old. It had split into a western and eastern half, each with its own emperor, its own court, and its own set of problems. The Western Empire was in a state of terminal decline, a slow and agonizing descent into chaos. But in the East, in the magnificent city of Constantinople, a new dynasty was rising, and with it came a woman. Who would prove that a queen's power could be even more absolute and terrifying than that of any Roman empress before her? Her name was Theodora. You see, Theodora did not come from a noble or even a wealthy family. She was born into the lowest social class, the daughter of a bear trainer at the Constantinople Hippodrome. This was a world of spectacle, and spectacle alone, a place of wild animals, gladiators, and performers who lived and died for the entertainment of the masses. It was a brutal and unforgiving world, and in it, Theodora learned the art of survival. From a young age, she was a performer herself, a celebrated actress and a dancer whose beauty and wit were legendary. But the word actress in this period was a polite term for a woman who was, by many accounts, a courtesan, a woman who sold her body for a living. The stories of her depravity were legion. It was said that she was so shameless in her performances that she would dance nude, a public display of her own raw sensuality. The historian Procopius, a man who hated Theodora with a deep and burning passion, wrote of her with a kind of breathless disgust, describing a woman who would engage in acts so lewd and so bizarre that they defied description. He painted a picture of a woman who was a walking scandal, a figure of a shocking and theatrical depravity that was the talk of the entire city. But Theodora was more than just a courtesan. She was a woman of immense intelligence and ambition, a woman who was deeply and painfully aware of her low social status. She was a survivor, and she was determined to escape the life she had been born into. Her chance came when she met Justinian, a man who would one day become the most powerful emperor of the Byzantine Empire. He was a man of ambition, a man who saw in Theodora not just a beautiful woman, but a powerful mind. A woman who understood the inner workings of a world that he, as a nobleman, could never truly comprehend. He was completely and utterly besotted with her, and in a love story that would make even the most cynical of men weep, he made her his wife. This was a scandal in and of itself. No emperor had ever married a woman of such low birth, and the Roman world was aghast. But Justinian, in a show of his own power, changed the law to make it possible. And in a beautiful and moving ceremony, they were married. But her depravity, according to her enemies, did not end with her marriage. As empress, she was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who wielded power with an iron fist. She was her husband's equal, a coroller who would often give him advice and direction. But her rule was marked by a ruthless and unforgiving ambition. It was said that she was a woman who was consumed by a desire for vengeance, a woman who would use her power to destroy anyone who had ever wronged her. Her early life as a courtesan had left her with a deep and abiding resentment for the powerful and the wealthy, and she used her newfound power to crush them. The stories of her cruelty were legendary. She was said to have had her enemies tortured and executed, a ruthless campaign of revenge that was both terrifying and complete. She was a woman who was not afraid to use her power to settle old scores. A woman who, in her own way, was as monstrous as the emperors she ruled over. She was a woman who had come from nothing, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that she would never return to that life. But her depravity, according to her supporters, was not what it seemed. They painted a picture of a woman who was a defender of the poor and the downtrodden, a woman who used her power to help those who had no one else to turn to. She was a woman who championed the rights of women, a woman who passed laws that made it illegal to force women into prostitution, a woman who built homes for former courtesans, giving them a new life and a new hope. She was a woman who, in her own way, was a kind of revolutionary, a woman who was fighting for a more just and a more compassionate world. She was a woman who had seen the worst of humanity. And she was a woman who was determined to use her power to make the world a better place. But even in her acts of charity, her enemies saw a kind of ruthless ambition. They claimed that her charity was just a way to gain power, a way to build a loyal following among the masses. They saw her not as a saint, but as a cunning political schemer, a woman who used her compassion as a tool for her own gain. And so, we come to the moment that would define her legacy, the Nika riots. You see, the Roman hippodrome, where Theodora had once performed, was more than just a place of entertainment. It was the heart of the city's political life, a place where the people could voice their opinions and a place where a mob could turn into an unstoppable force. The two main factions in the hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, were not just sports teams. They were political parties, and their rivalry was both fierce and bloody. In the year 532, a riot broke out between the factions, and it quickly escalated into a full-blown rebellion against the emperor. The city of Constantinople was set ablaze, and the people, in their fury, were demanding that Justinian and Theodora be deposed. Justinian, in a moment of panic, was ready to flee. His advisors were urging him to escape the city, to save himself and the dynasty from the angry mob. But Theodora, a woman who had seen a riot before, a woman who knew the streets of Constantinople better than any man in the court, would not have it. In a moment of pure, unadulterated heroism, she stood before her terrified husband and his advisors and delivered a speech that would echo through the annals of history. "Royalty is a magnificent burial shroud," she said, a chilling and powerful statement of her own resolve. She told them that an emperor must never run from his people, that he must either live as an emperor or die as one. She was a woman who had faced death and depravity in her life, and she was not about to run from a mob. She urged Justinian to stay and fight, to show the people that he was not a coward. And in her quiet, unwavering strength, she convinced him. It was a moment that showed her true nature, a woman who was not just a schemer, but a leader. A woman who had the courage to face death with a quiet dignity. Her plan, a ruthless and brilliant one, was to send her general Belisarius to the hippodrome to crush the rebellion. He did so with a ferocity that was both terrifying and complete, slaughtering the rioters and leaving the hippodrome a bloody mess. The rebellion was crushed, but the cost was immense. Thousands of people were killed, and the city was left in ruins. But in the end, Theodora's will had won. She had saved her husband's throne, and she had cemented her own reputation as a formidable and ruthless quarreler. She was a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to stay in power, even if it meant sacrificing the lives of thousands of her own people. Her story reminds us that the line between ambition and depravity is a thin one, and that a woman who has nothing to lose can be the most terrifying force of all. She was a woman who, in her own way, saved the Roman Empire. But in her saving, she became a figure of fear and awe, a woman who would be remembered for her strength and her wealth. And her witlessness, a woman who in her own unique and destructive way left a mark on history that would never be erased. She was a woman who lived with a philosopher, but she was a creature of passion, and perhaps that was her greatest sin. She was a woman who was perhaps too alive, too full of a fiery spirit that could not be contained by the quiet, contemplative life of a stoic empress. Her life was a constant struggle between her own wild nature and the rigid expectations of the Roman court. A battle that she was destined to lose, but in her losing, she created a legend that would last for centuries. The Roman Empire, by the time our next subject takes the stage, had moved far beyond its classical borders. It was a sprawling, multicultural realm, and its empresses no longer hailed exclusively from the ancient patrician families of Rome. This new reality brought with it a different kind of power. A power born not from old Roman blood, but from a fierce, almost spiritual ambition. Her name was Julia Domna, and she was a queen of a different kind. A woman who wielded influence not through public scandal, but through an almost unseen web of political and familial intrigue. She was the matriarch of a dynasty, a woman whose power was as much in her mind as it was in her title. You find yourself in the magnificent, sun-drenched city of Emesa, in modern-day Syria. This is where Julia Domna was born, into a family of powerful priests who served the local sun god, Elagabalus. This was a world of ancient, mystical rites and powerful prophecies, and Julia, from a young age, was steeped in its mysteries. The air in Emesa was heavy with the scent of incense and the murmur of prayers. And it was in this world of deep spirituality that Julia's intellect was forged. She was not a courtesan or a dancer, but an intellectual, a woman of deep thought and even deeper ambition. It was said that a prophecy foretold she would marry a man who would one day become emperor. This prophecy, whether a genuine divine omen or a clever piece of self-promotion, caught the attention of a rising star in the Roman military, a man by the name of Lucius Septimius Severus. He was a man of humble origins himself, a tough, pragmatic general from North Africa, who saw in Julia not just a wife, but an intellectual and political partner. It was a marriage of minds, a union of power and ambition, and it would set the stage for one of the most ruthless dynasties in Roman history. When Septimius Severus became emperor, you watch as Julia, now empress, moves from the mystical world of Syria to the heart of Rome. She brings with her a new, foreign sensibility, a different way of thinking that was both fascinating and unsettling to the old Roman elite. She was a patron of the arts and philosophy, a woman who held court with the great thinkers of the day, a figure of a different kind of power. She was not a public performer, like Theodora, but a quiet, intellectual force behind the throne. Her court, known as the Circle of Julia, became a haven for the greatest minds of the era, from the physician Galen to the jurist Ulpian. Philosophers and scholars would gather to debate the nature of the cosmos, the meaning of life, and the great works of Greek and Roman thought. The atmosphere was one of quiet intellectualism, a stark contrast to the brutal political maneuvering and military campaigns that defined her husband's reign. But her intellectual pursuits were a cover for her true ambition, to secure the Severan dynasty, to ensure that her family, her two sons, Caracalla and Geta, would rule the empire forever. It was here, in her fervent desire for a dynastic legacy, that her own kind of depravity would begin to show its face. You see, her two sons, Caracalla and Geta, were a study in fraternal hatred. They loathed each other from childhood, a rivalry so intense it bordered on open warfare. They were both heirs to the throne, and their rivalry was a constant source of anxiety for their mother, who tried and failed to reconcile them. She tried to make them see that their brotherly love was more important than their personal ambition, but it was a lost cause. Their hatred was a poison that would one day consume them both. You can imagine Julia, a woman of such intellect and such power, watching her sons tear each other apart. And in her own way, perhaps she began to see that her ruthless ambition had created two monsters she could no longer control. The depravity of Julia Dumna, you see, was not one of scandalous acts or public lewdness. It was a deeper, more insidious kind of corruption, a corruption of the soul. She was a woman who was so consumed by her desire for her sons to rule that she turned a blind eye to their monstrous behavior. When her husband, Septimius Severus, died, she was left to mediate between her two warring sons, and her attempts at reconciliation were a masterclass in failure. The brothers, now Kemperors, could not even stand to be in the same city. They lived in separate parts of the palace, surrounded by their own private guards, and a deep, chilling silence filled the halls of Rome. They would even divide their private collections of art and books, refusing to share anything, a petty rivalry that was a chilling omen of the far greater tragedy to come. It was a silent, simmering war that was destined to end in a bloodbath. The bloodbath, when it came, was swift and brutal. Caracalla, the more ruthless of the two, lured his brother to their mother's apartment, a supposed moment of reconciliation. You can picture it. Julia, perhaps with a sense of hope, waiting for her two sons to finally put aside their differences. But it was a trap. Caracalla's centurions burst into the room, and Geta, seeing his brother's betrayal, ran to his mother, clinging to her for dear life, for protection. But it was no use. The centurions under Caracalla's command stabbed Geta to death in his own mother's arms, a brutal, horrifying act of fratricide that would forever haunt her. Julia Domna, a woman who had spent her entire life trying to unite her family, now held the dying body of her own son, a victim of her own son's ruthless ambition. She was a woman who had spent her life trying to build a dynasty, and she had just watched it crumble into dust. The scene would be seared into her memory forever, the moment the intellectual and powerful empress became a grieving mother, the architect of a dynasty now faced with its most brutal and heartbreaking failure. Her life after this act of fratricide was a testament to her own deep and tragic depravity. She did not flee. She did not fall into despair. Instead, she continued to wield power to advise her murderous son, and to try to keep the dynasty together, a woman so obsessed with her legacy that she was willing to live with a monster who had killed her own son. She was a woman who had, in her own way, chosen power over love, legacy over family, and in doing so, she had become a kind of ghost, a silent, powerful force in a court of madness. Her life was a long, slow descent into a quiet, cold depravity, a woman who was a powerful intellectual, but who was so blinded by her own ambition that she had become complicit in the destruction of her own family. Her story is a chilling reminder that the greatest depravities are not always loud in public, but can be a quiet, internal rot, a slow and agonizing descent into a world where power is the only thing that matters. And so, you see, Julia Dumna was not a monster of scandalous acts or public lewdness. She was a queen of a different kind, a woman who in her own unique and quiet way showed us a new kind of depravity. A quiet internal kind, a depravity that was all the more terrifying for its silent, unwavering resolve. The sun which had risen on the conspiracies of Livia, the revelries of Messalina, the ambitions of Agrippina, the rebellions of Faustina, the intrigues of Julia Dumna, and the fierce resolve of Theodora, now begins its slow and gentle descent. The long and tumultuous day of Roman empresses is drawing to a close, and with it our journey through the darker, more scandalous corners of their lives. We have seen them not just as symbols of power, but as complex women who lived and loved and schemed in an age of immense turmoil. They were queens of a different kind, rulers of a hidden empire of influence, desire, and unbridled ambition. And now, in the quiet of the Roman twilight, we can reflect on their legacies, not with judgment, but with the sense of understanding for the wild, unpredictable world they inhabited. You find yourself standing on the Palatine Hill, a gentle breeze rustling through the cypress trees. The ghosts of these women and the stories they left behind feel close now. We began with Livia, the quiet manipulator, a woman who moved through the court like a shadow, a whisper of poison in a goblet of wine. She was a master of the unseen, a queen who knew that true power lay not in loud proclamations, but in subtle influence and the strategic removal of rivals. Her depravity was one of careful, calculated ambition, a cold and quiet pursuit of a dynastic dream. Her story reminds us that not all scandals are public. Some are slow-burning fires that consume from within. Then we journeyed to the vibrant, chaotic world of Messalina, a woman who lived her scandals out in the open, with a laugh that could be heard across Rome. She was not a strategist, but a force of nature, a queen who embraced her appetites with a joyful, almost childlike abandon. Her life was a feast of indulgence, a relentless pursuit of pleasure that defied all convention and decorum. Her story, filled with its tales of daring exploits and uninhibited parties, is not just a tale of depravity, but a story of a woman who refused to be contained, who saw the world as her personal playground. She was a scandalous comet, burning brightly and briefly, leaving a trail of gossip and a reputation that would last for millennia. From there, we met Agrippina, a woman of unyielding ambition and a fierce, almost terrifying love for her son. She was a queen who saw her family as a weapon, a means to seize and hold power. And she was willing to do anything to see her son, Nero, on the throne. Her story is a testament to the dark side of maternal devotion, a tale of manipulation, murder, and a hunger for control that consumed her and ultimately her own son. She was a queen who tried to rule from behind a boy emperor, and in the end, her son's rebellion against her was as much a political act as it was an act of a child seeking freedom. And then there was Faustina, a woman whose alleged depravities were less about her own actions and more about the rumor and scandal that swirled around her. She was a queen who lived in the shadow of a truly great man, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and in that shadow, the whispers of her supposed licentiousness grew to a roar. Her story is a chilling reminder of the power of rumor, a story of a woman who was perhaps no more scandalous than anyone else in her court, but who was so thoroughly and convincingly slandered that her name became a byword for infidelity and betrayal. Her tale is a quiet reminder that the greatest depravity can sometimes be the one that is invented for you. A narrative woven by your enemies. We saw Theodora, the former courtesan who rose to become a powerful empress, a woman who used her wit and her will to survive a world that was designed to break her. Her story is a powerful tale of a woman who, in her own unique way, transcended her origins and became a force of political and spiritual power. Her scandals were not the kind that came from a love of vice, but from a life of survival. And her story is a testament to the fierce resolve of a woman who refused to let her past define her. And finally, we met Julia Dumna, the intellectual empress, a woman who traded in philosophy and power. Her depravity was not one of scandalous acts, but of a quiet, insidious ambition, a willingness to stand by as her sons tore each other apart for the sake of a dynasty. She was a queen of a different kind, a woman who showed us that the greatest depravities are not always loud in public, but can be a quiet, internal rot, a slow and agonizing descent into a world where power is the only thing that matters. As you reflect on these women, their lives, and their legacies, you can see that their stories are more than just tales of scandal. They are reflections of a world that was both magnificent and monstrous, a world of great art and brutal violence, of philosophical debate and political assassination. These women were a product of that world, and they, in turn, shaped it with their passions and their flaws. The sun has now set. The Roman air has grown cool, and the stars, ancient and unblinking, now fill the sky. The stories of these women, their triumphs and their betrayals, their loves and their hatreds, have now been told. Their voices, once lost to history, now whisper on the wind, a quiet reminder of a world that once was. You can close your eyes now and let their stories settle into the quiet corners of your mind. A final, fascinating chapter in the long and winding history of the Roman Empire. You can rest now, for the night is long and the stories have come to an end. Sleep well.